In today's episode of Time Out, we have the legend, superstar, Michael Boyle. It's a dream come true for us. And our Vice President Suresh was all excited and curated a lot of questions. Welcome to our show, Mike. It's a pleasure. It's a delight, and I have no words to express. And the whole team in our gym is just waiting for the show. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, India, the Hindi-speaking market is just a huge market that I think is really untapped. Surprisingly, like I said, you've mentioned when we were kind of off camera or off podcast that people at least do know that I exist in India, so that's good.
No, I mean, sort of a demigod here. We all know about you, but still, we would like to hear it from the horse's mouth. We would like to have a short bio about yourself, especially the way you grew up, school, college, what sport you played. I know that you did a little bit of powerlifting and stuff like that. Can you please throw some light?
Sure. It's funny. I grew up, my father was a high school principal. So he was also a high school football coach, high school basketball coach. When I was a kid growing up, he was the basketball coach. I kind of missed the football era, but I was a high school football player. I wanted to be an American football player in the worst way. And the best thing about wanting to be an American football player is that it led me to strength and conditioning. And I always said my career was ended by lack of size and lack of ability. I wasn't big enough and I wasn't good enough. So that ended relatively quickly. I played 1 year of college. I was actually a pretty good swimmer. Would have been a better college swimmer than college football player. But to be truthful, at that time, I did not have what it took to swim in college because they were swimming, an hour and a half to 2 hours a day, twice a day. And I just had no interest in that amount of time in the pool. I enjoyed swimming, meets, races. I did not enjoy the training part that much. So it all kind of worked out the way that it should have. I went to Springfield College, which is in the U.S., might be the premier physical education school in the United States. At least those of us who went to Springfield like to think that it is. And I was there for 5 years. I got a master's degree. I studied athletic training because strength and conditioning did not exist. They're really, I didn't know anybody at that time who had a job as a strength and conditioning coach. And we were just beginning to see stuff at that time. It was magazines, but in magazines about some schools hiring a strength and conditioning coach. So I suddenly realized that this, I got into powerlifting in college kind of as a hobby, just because I was lifting for football and then football was gone. And I was studying athletic training, and it seemed like a very natural intersection of those two places to be in strength and conditioning. And I got a job as an athletic trainer. I worked for about 6 months and I resigned to be a strength coach, to be a volunteer. So I quit my paid job.
Okay.
And I took a volunteer position at the same university, Boston University. And I stayed there. Actually, I stayed there for 30 years. The first 8 or 9, I was like a volunteer part-time guy. And then I had about roughly a 10-year period where I was paid. Then I kind of resigned to open my own business, but I stayed again on kind of a part-time basis. But I was there for 30 years. I've been coaching for 40, this is my 40th year of actual coaching at the college level or higher. So
fabulous. I mean, you live in New York, and what's your city?
No, Boston.
You live in Boston, and a little info on your family.
I have married. I have 2 children who are actually very good athletes. I have a daughter who's an ice hockey player in college, is a full scholarship ice hockey player. Last year, I think she was 8th in United States college hockey in goals scored. So she's pretty good. And then I have a 16-year-old son who plays ice hockey and plays lacrosse, and probably will play lacrosse in college. He's a pretty good lacrosse player.
I just want to ask a little about your one arms. What's your best one arm in deadlift?
I think my best in a meet was 475. I think I pulled 500 in the deadlift in training, but never in a meet. I squatted and deadlifted both 475 as a 181 pounder. So
right. And what's your best in bench press?
Best in bench press 275 in a meet, and I think I managed to squeak up like a pretty sloppy 315 once in my life. I was not a great bench presser.
Okay, now I'm going to start shooting questions to you. And the first question, I'm sure you heard it a million times. And Popular question. What is functional training and what is not functional training according to you?
So I have two answers for that. What is functional training? So functional training for me is the application of functional anatomy to training. So it's taking what we know about how muscles actually work and then applying that into the training process. So I think, when you talk about what's functional, what's non-functional, I don't feel like, non-functional machines. So if you wanted to, look at the continuum, then machine-based training is sort of the epitome of non-functional training. If you're looking at the other end of the continuum, probably pure unilateral training like a one-leg squat is probably the other end. And then there's a lot of stuff in between, when you start looking at, they have squat machines. A squat machine is probably more functional than a leg press. A two-leg barbell squat is probably more functional than the squat machine. A one-leg squat is probably more functional than a barbell squat. And if you look, that book that you have has, we kind of called it the functional continuum, and we talked about that idea of it's not really an either or thing as much as it is, most functional to least functional kind of perspective.
Brilliantly articulated. Your article, 25 years, 25 mistakes. I mean, it was an unbelievable read, and I think I resonate a lot with that particular article. If you have to pen it down again today, what are the things you'll add to that?
Yeah, I don't know how many things there are that I would really update, because the one thing about that article, I hate to say it was timeless, but it really is. It's really resonated for people over a really long period of time. And it's, in that way, it's funny, like someone like you, like it's very frequent that people will reference that article. And that article was written, I wrote it on a train ride to New York City, and it actually was in response to a Barbara Walters special that I'd seen on TV. And it was something like, I think she was retiring, and it was, 50 years of Barbara Walters or something like that. And I thought, wow, that would be a great, some type of article like that. I actually have another 60 for 61 that I keep trying to write, and I keep having to change the title of it because I'm trying to think of 60 things in 60 years, but now I'm in the 61st year. So it doesn't really work out the way that I wanted to. So I'm actually, what I'm doing, I'm pulling up the article right now because I'm going to look at the first things and say, are there things that I really would change?
And I noticed that most of the interesting articles come in a very casual way, and then it hits the dogmas of many people, and it's sort of etched in your head after that.
Yeah, well, you know what? I tell you the one I would change. Mistake number 8. I said mistake number 8 was listening to track coaches, and I found myself listening to track coaches more, which obviously resonates with you because you're a track and field person. But for a while, I really got away from it because I felt like there just weren't enough good sprint coaches. I feel like there was a massive gap between, say, Charlie Francis and Lawrence Seagraves and Kevin O'Donnell, and then, where we are now, like, the Tony Hollers, Chris Corfists of the world. And during that time, there was about a 30-year gap where I didn't feel like anybody was adequately filling that space. Absolutely. And I felt like there were a lot of people who were, what happens sometimes is you're so busy defending your turf. You're so busy trying to tell everybody about track that you don't see, like, initially, most of the big influencers in strength and conditioning were track and field people. When you look back at, like, Charlie Francis and, Vern Gambetta and Don Chu, and, a lot of those guys came out of a track and field background. I remember the best speakers when I was young at the NSCA convention tended to be track coaches, not strength coaches.
And back in the 50s, 60s, or Yuri Verkhoshansky and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, but you think about, the Verkhoshansky stuff, that stuff is, you're talking ancient. That's probably 60-year-old stuff.
Yeah, that stuff. It's all started there.
And I still recommend, someone asks me for a book on speed development, and I still send them to Charlie Francis Training System.
Absolutely.
But that's almost sad when you think, nobody, that book was, I want to say 84, right? So if that book was 84, it was 37 years ago.
Yeah,
And 37 years, someone hasn't written a better book about sprinting.
absolutely.
And they haven't. I mean, that book was, I always say to people, like, read that book and then remind yourself. It was almost like Charlie saw the future in terms of, you know, he's talking about, you know, soft tissue work and massage and stretching. And I mean, all of these things that, that other people like weren't even contemplating at that particular point in time.
He spoke about arnica gel in the 80s, and he was talking about the thymol derivatives. He was probably ahead of his times.
Oh, he was light years ahead of his times. I mean, the unfortunate part is that he got caught up in the drug thing, and in a lot of ways that negated everything that he had said. People just went and were like, okay, you know, typical cancel culture at that time, like just erase Charlie Francis from, you know, from your name, from your book, from your thought process. And I always felt like that was a huge mistake, because as much as the drugs were a part of this, they really weren't the key. Everybody was doing drugs, but there were other things that Charlie was doing that was so much better than what everybody else was doing.
Actually, you answered my third question already. I mean, I wanted to ask you, you always credited yourself as a curator, and you've been very humble about it. And in the last 5 to 10 years, have you seen some real original guy with coming some cutting edge, somebody a la Charlie Francis? Have you seen anybody?
And yeah, I said Tony Holler. Tony's really the guy who, at least for me, kind of, and it's interesting. If you saw Tony looks, I joke, he looks just like me. He's 61-year-old bald guy with glasses. He's high school chemistry teacher, high school track coach, but he's a really good writer, a really good thinker, a very persuasive writer. And so he, you know, I said he was the guy that got me to make a really big change in our programming. I used to feel like timing was a pain in the ass. And you're a track and field guy, so you know. But one of the things that you don't realize if you're not a track and field person is the intent that timing produces. Like if someone said to you, you know, you're going to run 100 meters and we're not going to time it, you know, and I want you to run hard, you might run unconsciously at 85% of your top speed. But as soon as somebody drags a watch out, or, you know, a timing system gets turned on, you're not. You said if you were a 10.6 sprinter, you're not going to run at 11.6.
Absolutely.
With somebody timing you, because you don't want somebody to be like 11.6. You'd be like, that's terrible. So, you know, that was a huge, you know, Tony's record rank and published article was a real game changer for us.
I mean, I'm just going to put you on the spotlight a little. Describe the following persons in 2 lines or 3 lines, whatever you're feeling comfortable. Paul Chek, Charles Poliquin, and Louis Simmons.
Oh, you are putting me on the spot. I've never been in Louis' presence, so I will talk. I'll take him third. Paul, I felt like Paul was a brilliant guy. He was a guy who did a lot of really positive things for the field. I didn't think his presentation style was great. I think he and Poliquin had a lot in common in that way, in terms of one of the things I always said I learned from Paul Chek and from Poliquin was how I didn't want to treat people in a seminar setting, because I wasn't going to be rude to people. I wasn't going to belittle people. I wasn't going to try to show somebody that I was smarter than they were and make them feel badly about it. And I thought that those guys did a lot of that in their seminars and in their presentations. Both brilliant, you know, brilliant guys. Poliquin might have been one of the most brilliant guys in the field. And I got along good with them, but I watched the way he treated others. And I always felt like they taught me a great deal about how I didn't want to treat people. They taught me a great deal about how I wanted to interact with people, particularly in a seminar setting, in a setting where somebody's coming to you looking for knowledge. I think you need to be able to look at them and think, I need to be able to deliver this knowledge to you in a way that doesn't make you feel bad about yourself. How's that? And Louis is different. I don't know Louis at all. My issue with Louis is not Louis as much as it is the people who worship Louis, because, and I've put this in my presentations, and Louis probably, if he's ever paid any attention to me, probably doesn't like me because I'm frequently critical of the West Side thing. But Louis has openly admitted to lifelong steroid use. And so my issue with that is that it's very, very difficult to take strength advice from someone who's been doing it with, chemical help for the whole time. Because my thing, I've always said to people, if you look at the West Side system, it's hard to figure out where does the drug stop and the system begin. And would the system, because I've seen some terrible systems work really well when combined with drugs. Obviously, you were a world-class sprinter, so you have also seen that. You can take some people who had less than perfect training, but if their drug program was good, then their results were going to be good. And so I guess that was my beef with the West Side thing. My other beef with the West Side thing is that it was so influential. It feeds into kind of the meathead, the guy who wants to be a bilateral proponent, always is kind of pointing at West Side and saying, West Side is the way. West Side is how you're supposed to do it. And so I guess I've been a little bit of a rebel in the sense that I've said to people, I don't think that's the way at all. It may be the way for powerlifting. And I've always said that even in and of itself is questionable, because people who are powerlifting are critical of West Side, saying they have not developed the best powerlifters, even with that system. There are other systems that have worked much better. There are people, they have their own infighting going on within that system, but West Side has done a great job, much like CrossFit did, of grasping and capturing the masses. And that's something to be admired, to be honest. I look at kind of how they do that and think, is there a way that we can do that in a way that I can be comfortable with? Because in truth, I'd love to have the reach that CrossFit did. But obviously I don't think I could make the compromises that CrossFit made.
Absolutely. Your take on conditioning for general population versus team and sports athletes and stuff like that? Your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of it is the same. So if you look at our general program structure, it's identical in terms of everybody foam rolls, everybody stretches, everybody does their mobility work, everybody does power development work, everybody does a strength program that's built primarily around unilateral strength. So if you looked at that, you'd say, hey, the programs are identical. If you look at our athlete program, then you say, but we're sprinting, which we're not doing with our adult population. We may be Olympic lifting, which we're not doing with our adult population. And we're probably playing with heavier loads than we would with our adult population. So I think there's a tremendous amount of similarity. And, it might get into like, if you like the 80-20 Pareto principle kind of idea, I think 80% of it is very much the same and 20% of it is different. With our adult population, the 20% is different, is 20% that we just take out.
Mike, you've been very, very, what I would say, the most commonsensical coach I've seen with regards to training athletes. You've been very vocal about avoiding certain exercises pertaining to injuries and stuff like that. Can you list some exercises which you feel is of no value, the risk is more, I can't see any reward, and perhaps which leads to injuries?
If you said things that have no value, I always say anything done behind your neck, risk reward just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't care whether it's behind the neck press, behind the neck pull down, behind the neck jerk. We don't do anything behind your head because the average person lacks the external rotation capability to get into those positions. Any machine-based lower body exercise, I generally don't have any use for. So I have no use for leg extension, leg curl, leg press. Any of those things are things that I think are foolish. I'm not a fan of dips. I think I think it puts your shoulder in a really precarious position. Those have been burpees, obviously. And then I think burpees are just an exercise in dumbness. I look at people and think, I don't know. And it's amazing. Every time I say something about burpees, the burpee defenders come out of the woodwork, talking about why they're good. And I almost feel like I think the expression is better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and prove it, something along that line. And it's amazing, that way sometimes when people come out and defend burpees, I just think, you're just establishing the fact that you don't have any idea what you're talking about.
Uh, your take on hip thrust, bench press, and deadlift for athletes, especially in season.
All right. So I'm not a hip thrust fan.
So am
I am a unilateral hip thrust fan. I love, we would call it, hip lift. I don't like the name hip thrust because I think hip thrust denotes sort of an uncontrolled extension of the hips, which usually ends up being an uncontrolled lumbar extension. When I watch most people do, the barbell version of the hip thrust, I think there's a really negative lumbar component to that exercise. I think when you flex one knee and then do that same exercise, it's crazy. We just ordered something called, and it is the worst name ever, a booty blaster, which is like Contreras' hip thruster bench, similar idea, band loaded. Because I really want to be able to do that exercise with more load. I think the single leg hip thrust is one of the most underutilized exercises that's out there. Double leg, we never do. I have no use for it. When I see people with the big pads and, trying to make it's like trying to make a really uncomfortable exercise comfortable. Doesn't make any sense to me. Bench press, I like bench press, to be honest. I'm not an anti-bench press person at all. I think if you bench press once a week with good technique, you're never going to have a shoulder issue. I think the biggest problem with bench pressing is just that people bench press too much, too many sets, too many times per week, and they create their own problems. But I don't have a problem with the exercise per se. I actually like it. The kids that I train like it. It's it's still a pretty good indicator of upper body strength. Sorry, you said
deadlift.
Hip thrust. Oh, deadlift. And I do not like the barbell deadlift at all. We haven't done a barbell deadlift. I couldn't even tell you when. I don't know if we've ever done it with athletes. If we did, it was probably in the 1980s. So you're looking at, much more than 30 years ago, if we did it at all. And I'm not sure we did it at all. But I've really become a huge trap bar, hex bar deadlift fan. It is my favorite. If you said bilateral strength movement, without question, hex bar deadlift is going to be my favorite bilateral strength movement. I think it's wonderful because it's like the bar goes right through your body because you're standing inside it.
Right.
And so as a result, you can,
regardless
of the dimensions of the person, you can fit them into that bar. Some people are going to have, squatty looking deadlifts, more like what the sumo deadlift might look like for somebody else. And then someone who's, a different body type might have more of a hingy looking deadlift, but everybody's going to be able to get in that bar and move some weight around and be able to do it pretty safely and effectively. But with that said, we still don't do that with our adult clients. We don't do any heavy bilateral loading, with our adult clients, goblet squats, kettlebell deadlifts. They get to the point where they can goblet squat a 100-pound dumbbell and they can kettlebell deadlift our 44-kilo kettlebell. Then we're going to be on to more unilateral stuff and forget about the bilateral stuff.
Your go-to method when an athlete develops a reactive patellar tendinopathy?
Reactive patellar tendinopathy? That's a really interesting question because I would have answered it differently 2 months ago. I listened to a bunch of podcasts from Jill Cook, who's an Australian.
I read about it.
Probably I think the most knowledgeable person out there in terms of patellar tendinopathy. If I got someone who had a true patellar tendinopathy, then obviously the one thing that she says is just heavy, slow. Because she's like, if you do heavy, slow stuff, that person with a true tendinopathy is going to be fine. The difference is in distinguishing whether or not you have a patellofemoral problem or a true patellar tendinopathy. That's really your big differentiator. And that's where she made a really, really good point. She said patellar tendinopathy is going to be young, jumping males almost exclusively. Maybe your fast bowler in cricket, like you said, who's going to be landing repetitively on one leg might develop that. But in general, you're going to be seeing more patellofemoral problems. And the difference is the solutions to those are not the same. The solution to patellofemoral pain is, you've read a bunch of my stuff, the does it hurt idea. We're going to go back, vertical tibia. So, we're not going to push knees over toes. We're going to really maintain vertical tibia. We're not going to do anything that's painful. We're going to spend a lot of time, on ankle mobility. We're going to spend time on calf strength. We're going to spend time on hip strength, because we're realizing that knee is just the guy stuck in the middle of generally, a malfunctioning foot and hip. So I guess the biggest difference when you say patellar tendinopathy is making sure that that's really what you got. If you've got something, that I call it MWP, mysterious wandering pain. If you've got something that moves around, you don't have patellar tendinopathy. If it's not always, like someone with real patellar tendinitis, it's always going to be in their patellar tendon all the time. Somebody with patellofemoral, sometimes it's going to be patellar tendon, sometimes it's going to be under the kneecap, sometimes it's going to be medial. That person doesn't have tendinopathy. So as you said, the differential diagnosis is really big.
What's your stand on isometrics, heavy isometrics?
I would say I'm probably not a fan of heavy isometrics if you're talking about like, mid-thigh pull, that kind of stuff like that people like to use right now. I'm not a fan because I just don't see the value of it. And I think it's one of those things that we have commercials in the United States for something called Life Cereal. And the slogan is, they're like, what is it? And it's like, they say it's some stuff, it's supposed to be good for you. And I feel like sometimes that's the case with a lot of the isometric stuff, is that some stuff it's supposed to be good for you. I like an isometric phase. I do not, I think, like heavy, super maximal, like, put the bar in the racks and pull as hard as you can against the pins, that kind of thing. I'm not a fan. But if you said, do some 1 minute iso holds with a reasonably heavy load, then I become a fan, and I become a fan only for about 3 weeks of a phase. The other thing with isometrics, athletes hate them. So you have to really be able to dose it in at appropriate times in a small amount. Like a lot of times when we do our iso phase, it's literally like one exercise a day. So, there might be like a knee dominant one day, a hip dominant another day, an upper push and an upper pull over the course of the week, where we do some kind of really hard isometric, but we won't tend to do, let's say, 4 exercises with, 1 minute isos in the course of the single day's workout, because you'll start to lose some people. You have to have some really good compliant athletes to do a really hard iso phase.
You use it as a finisher or as a main part of the program?
Main part of the program. So when we do it, we do it as a main part of the program. So we're going to, in that phase, we might have like what we will tend to do, what we would call an iso eccentric phase. So we might have some elements of longer eccentrics, 5-second lowers, and then another element of isometric holds, split squat holds, Nordic holds, TRX row or ring row holds, things like that, but not too much.
I mean, thank God you came out with this theories on plyometrics. Otherwise, the whole body was waiting on 2 times body weight for squat and stuff like that. Please tell us the progression for plyometrics.
We start jumping right away. Jumping, hopping. I mean, the idea that you need 2 times body weight squat to do plyometrics, one, it's completely wrong. And it's really interesting because I was at a seminar where somebody was questioning that. And actually at that time, Vern Gambetta, who probably falls in the Paul Chek and Charles Poliquin category of how not to treat people, was in the back of the room, and he raised his hand and he said, I have to take credit for that. He said, somebody asked me a long time ago about a guideline for plyometrics. And he said, I threw that out there and it stuck. He said, really bad idea. So we look at it and think, we start our jumping and hopping progressions, which are not really, that's the other thing. Our initial jumps are not plyometric.
Exactly.
They are jumps. So initially we start with jumps and hops and bounds and sticking landings, because again, when you go back to the patellar tendinopathy thing, we want to develop a tendon readiness. And we're going to get that not by the reactive aspect of it, but by sort of the heavy, that's really, I say that's your heavy eccentric loading. When you say to somebody, hop over a 6-inch hurdle and stick the landing, that's a heavy eccentric loading because you're going through a real hard eccentric to an isometric. And it was interesting because I didn't know this, but when I listened to Jill Cook, it was either Jill Cook or I can't think of the other guys. There were two of them back to back on this. It's called Jacked Athlete Podcast. Jay Coutura, Turra, or Tuura, I forget which. But in those situations, the other guy whose name is escaping me talked about the fact that the ultimate point of tendon loading is when you switch from an eccentric contraction to a concentric contraction. If you're going to have a problem, it will be at that moment. And so by us sticking our landings initially, we're preparing for that moment better. And then we bounce, then we get like a little, kind of what we would call a mini bounce to introduce some eccentric to concentric switching to that tendon. And then we do plyometrics. So for us, we often don't get to plyometrics until week 7 of our progression.
So, very true. I started bounding and hopping when I was 12 years old. And as you rightly said, the preparedness for your tendon starts at that age. And then probably we can progress into the heavy depths and drop jumps and stuff like that. Well said.
Exactly.
And I know your love for ice hockey. 2 of your children are playing ice hockey, and your work in groin injuries in sports is very well known. We are all ears. Please, what is your approach?
With groin injuries, the biggest thing with groin injuries is that's where we would do things that people might consider as non-functional training. Because, with our hockey players in the summer, we will do a hip flexion progression where we might start lying on the ground doing, like a band loaded hip flexion pattern lying on the ground. We might then progress that to a band loaded or a plate loaded or a Kaiser loaded standing hip flexion. We might then progress that into what we would call hip flexion adduction. So sort of like striking a soccer ball kind of pattern. Because what you realize with groin injuries, it's people that are involved in the flexion adduction pattern. And basically you've got hockey players and soccer players. They're your big groin injury people. And when you really look at groin injuries, one of the things, I wrote an article called Understanding Hip Flexion May Mean Understanding Adduction. And understanding, I remember reading in Kendall's book, Muscles, Testing, and Function. I was reading in, the book said something about 7 hip flexors. And I remember stopping going, 7?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm missing a couple, like, okay, what am I missing? Which ones aren't there? And then I kind of go down through the list and I realize that, there's a couple of what we would call adductor muscles that are flexor adductors. So when we look at that pattern, the real pattern that we want to train is a combination hip flexion adduction pattern, that act of pulling the leg towards the midline and bringing the knee up to 90 degrees at the same time. So that's why, like, you look at the old idea of, multi-hip machine kind of thing, where you're doing, I always say to people, if you're doing straight leg ab and adduction, then you don't understand anatomy. And if you don't understand anatomy, you really can't do rehab and you really can't do training. You need to know what your muscles are doing. And unfortunately, too many people don't.
Absolutely. We make it a point here in our gym too. We just give the skeleton and the clay. Almost for 6 months, we ensure that they have a sound footing on anatomy. Otherwise, in the long run, they are found wanting.
Yep. You need to understand, we always talk about, you need to know dead person anatomy, kind of where the muscle goes, where, origin, insertion, or insertion origin, depending on how you want to look at it. But then you really need to know functional anatomy. You need to understand, like, okay, when I stand up, what's that muscle doing? Because, in spite of knowing, kind of where it starts and where it ends, knowing what it's doing in weight bearing is really critical.
True. Your material with medicine ball training is simply mind-blowing. Very simple. It's a very, I would say, a straight-jacketed method where it's simple step-by-step progression. Can you throw some light on that?
I think everything we do is that way. I think everything we do is simple step-by-step progression. And I think that's deliberate. It's just, some of it is developmental sequencing. We were talking in our staff meeting the other day about what Greg Rose called 4x4 matrix, with the idea that, starting, on your back in like a supine, hook lying position, or a, supine, that kind of 90-90 position, and then progressing to a quadruped position, and then progressing to a half kneel position, and then progressing to a standing progression or position. And what we did is we just tried to look at everything that we do in that way. So if we're looking at, medicine balls, it's like, okay, we might start, in half kneeling, and then we might go to standing, and then we might go to standing and stepping, and then we might go to two stepping or crossing over. It's simply increasing the complexity of the task until you get to something. Like I said, cricket is always, the big thing is fast bowlers, right? So you start looking at, your medicine ball work in cricket and think eventually at the end, it should probably look like something like fast bowling, in the way that for us, it should look like, the golf swing, or it should look like,
The baseball
the
pitch.
hockey slap. And I don't know enough about cricket, but in pitching, they have to go downhill. There's a mound that you come off of. And so, we went out and bought metal wedges so that we could start doing our medicine balls in more of a downhill aspect, because what you realize is that for pitchers, when you start to really understand, American baseball pitching, a lot of the stress comes from being on the mound and being more downhill. So we wanted to simulate that downhill in our medicine ball throwing progression. So I think a lot of it is just, I think it's just thinking. That's redundant, but it's just thinking. It's thinking through what the person is going to have to do in their particular sports skill and gradually moving them in that direction.
Reverse engineer it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And I also noticed that in most of your books, it's very, what you initially said was so true. Functional anatomy is actually understanding functional anatomy and putting it to use. It's very well said. And do you consider medicine ball training as a primary training or auxiliary training?
I think it's primary. Everybody that we have is doing medicine ball work. Like I look at now and think that kind of what we would call, for our athletes, our sprint, jump, throw sequence is really, really important. So we're gonna throw some medicine balls. We're gonna do some jumps, some hops, some bounds, and we're gonna run some sprints. And that's really, like, to me, I might almost look at that now and say it's more important than the strength part, because the one thing that Tony Holler really made me think about was the fact that there've been great sprinters who didn't weight train. And I always go back to, I showed somebody this the other day. I pulled up a clip of Bolt weight training. Bolt's weight training is terrible. I mean, it looks like, it looks like my buddies in the gym in 1980. I mean, just really, really, not great stuff.
Carl Lewis never did much of weight training.
Yeah, exactly. Lewis was not a big, but these guys were still among the best sprinters in the world. And the one thing that kind of Tony made me think about was that, well, what's the common denominator? Running fast, right? He always talks about the fact that you can't, you go in the weight room, you can't mimic 10 meters a second in the weight room. There's nothing you can do. At its fastest, you can get to about 2 meters a second. You know what I mean? If you're like really powerful in the snatch or something like that, 2 meters a second, it would be really, really fast in the weight room. So one of the things we've tried to emphasize with our, with everything that we're talking about now, is to view sprinting and throwing, and particularly sprinting, as a training tool, not as a training test. We used to look at sprinting as something that you tested a couple times a year. And we did it, but we didn't do it with the intent that we needed. And I think, probably the next progression of that, if we can figure out how to do it, will be to get our radar guns on the medicine balls more, so we can create more intent in the rotational throwing patterns. We're not there yet, but I think that's probably where we need to be.
What are your unpenned thoughts? And is your next book coming?
My next book is coming, yes. I am rewriting. I wrote a book called Designing Strength Training Programs and Facilities that probably not a lot of people read, because I self-published it, Perform Better sold it for me. If I was guessing, we've sold a few thousand copies of that particular book. And then after that, I did Advances in Functional Training with my friend Larry Draper. That sold a lot of copies. I don't know exactly how many, but that sold probably something more like 25,000 copies. And I'd like to get the Designing Strength Training Programs and Facilities done, give that to Larry, let her kind of work her magic with that book like she did with Advances, and be able to get that book out. I'm hoping, realistically, it's probably a 2022 thing, but when it's done, I think it's going to be very, very good, because the new functional training for sports is written for a really broad audience. You know, it's written for coaches, trainers, therapists, parents. It's, you know, it's written to be a little bit generic, whereas this other book is not written to be generic. It's more of, you know, what I would call a hardcore strength and conditioning book. So I think people that like my writing will really like this new one when it gets done.
Go well, Mike. Go on, onward and upward there. And if you had to suggest 2 books for young strength and conditioning coaches, what will that be?
First one would probably be Mark Verstegen's, the original Core Performance. I always call it the red cover Core Performance. But if you find the Core Performance that's a red and white cover with Mark's picture on the front, that to me was a landmark work, because it was so kind of basic common sense. It's now what people would identify as the Exos system, but it really was Mark putting that system down on paper. There's some stuff in it now that, you know, I think if you've got to do over, there's some things you take out, but in general, it's about the same era as my original Functional Training for Sports, probably 2004, 2005. But I would say to people, read that one first. And then I'd probably go Charlie Francis Training System as the second one, because I think, you know, people kind of overlooked that book because it was perceived as a track book. And then, as I said to you, sort of, you know, off mic, there was also the steroid thing with Charlie Francis that sort of maybe steered some people away. But that book is an amazing work. I'm sad that Charlie did not live long enough to sort of regarner all of the attention that he probably should have gotten over the years.
I think gold dust, that book was a piece of gold dust.
Yes, it really was. I mean, there's stuff I reread it not too long ago, and I just, as I said to you, I was fascinated. It's like, I can't believe he was saying this stuff in the 80s. But that's what led me, you know, I started thinking about, you know, about massage and about stretching and about, there were things that he was emphasizing in that book that made sense to me, that resonated with me at that time. And it really helped me.
You're the 4th guest in this timeout who says this. Strength and conditioning coaches, please start from the track. And your supported track is unbelievable. And again, it goes back to Charlie Francis, and much before that, in the 60s, talking about Yuri Verkhoshansky. And it all evolved from there. And now we have Michael Boyle. And it was an absolute pleasure this evening to host you. I mean, it was a sort of a dream come true for us. And all the best, and go very well in the future, waiting for your book.
Thank you. And I'm hoping I make it to India someday. That's on my list, to be honest. It's a place that I would love to see. It's funny, I just watched a movie about the Rani. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, but I'm sure you are. It's in Indian history. But it was really interesting to see. And it makes me that much more think, wow, I have to get there, because it's a really interesting country and a really interesting region, because you have sort of it was very tribal, and you have the British influence, and there's just a lot of like really cool stuff to dig into.
Dynamics are huge here in this country. You'll love it. I mean, just let me know. I mean, I was always wondering, I should invite you for a seminar or a workshop or something. We can do something.
Okay. Well, where are you? Are you?
I'm based in Chennai.
Chennai. Okay.
Chennai is a southern part of the country, and sort of hub for fitness, I would say, in India. And a lot of trainers have come from this part of the world. And obviously, I mean, everything started with guys like you. We started following you all, and now everything is, I would say, a lot more organized than what it used to be in the past.
Oh, great. I appreciate it.